Biomutant was released back in May of 2021, which is kind of hard to believe how fast time has flown these past few years because the game definitely doesn't feel like it was released that long ago. I just recently finished up my playthrough of Biomutant, and in this review I'll highlight just about everything the game has to offer, and I'll go in depth in the various systems it has in place as well. But before diving into the review, let's first get a brief history on the development of the game and how it's fared since its release. So the game was developed by Experiment 101, which was a newly founded Swedish studio established in 2015. Now, the studio was established by former Avalanche Studio employees who are the same developers known for the Just Cause series, which was an open world game filled with pure mayhem. And given the fact that the Just Cause games were known for their chaotic open worlds, it felt like Biomutant was right up their alley. On its release, the game did okay, scoring a 63 on Metacritic for its PS4 release. That's a pretty low score given today's standards. However, that didn't stop the game from selling as well as it did, shipping over 1 million copies by August 2021, which was just months after its release. So that's a brief history of Biomutant. Let's actually start chipping away at what the game is. Real quick, before I actually jump into this review, I'd like to do a quick self-promo. On this channel, I like to review all types of games, new and old. So if you're into that type of content with in-depth reviews, please feel free to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. So in Biomutant, you play as a custom-created mutant that resembles either a raccoon or a squirrel of some sort. But throughout your time in Biomutant, there's a lot that you can do. You can participate in tribal wars, take on huge world bosses that are quite literally consuming the planet, take on dozens and dozens of side quests, explore a big open world with hidden bunkers and secrets and puzzles, all while piling up mountains of loot. And I mean mountains. If this sounds like a good time for you, stick around because we're just getting started. So I'll start with the story of Biomutant, which is probably one of its weakest points. The story is there more so as a thing to keep you going from mission to mission, but it never really gripped me in any way, and it never became interesting. That's typically okay in a big open world game where most of your time is spent exploring and scavenging, but it never felt like the story really took itself seriously. A lot of the NPC names are a play on words or some kind of attempt at a joke. Your main goal in the story is interestingly split into a couple of different streams. And since these are pretty obvious from the start and don't really spoil anything, I'll go ahead and mention them. First, you participate in a tribal war, where you have a choice of joining one of the various tribes and cooperating with them to take over various tribal outposts and eventually the tribe's main fort. The tribal war essentially represents a third of the game, and I'll go into more detail of the mission structure for that portion of the game in a different section of the review. So you have your tribal wars, and then you also have the big problem known as the World Eaters. These are huge bosses that are spelling the impending doom for the world as you know it. Defeating these World Eaters are another main objective of the game, and throughout this portion of the story, you'll encounter a variety of NPCs, each unique from the other and offering some new gadget to make your open world travel easier and also a way to defeat a World Eater. Then finally, there's another portion of the game which is more decision based and coincides both with the tribal war and the World Eater missions, but I won't spoil this one in particular as it asks you to make some important decisions. So that sums up the story of the game. There isn't a lot of substance there, as I mentioned previously, as it feels like it's more of a way to pedal the player along from point A to point B. Okay, so let's talk about gameplay. In other words, the most important part of a game, at least in my opinion. Biomutant at its core is an action RPG. In it, you control your mutant who can do just about everything. So let's start with melee combat, which has a fair amount of depth to it. You can wield one-handed or two-handed weapons that have an array of combos that can be performed. These combos are otherwise known as Wung Fu, but essentially they boil down to just being a sequence of button presses that you can pull off some big damage with. Hitting the square button sets off a chain of attacks that can be intertwined with really any other phase button or trigger depending both on the combo you're attempting to pull off as well as the weapon type that you're using. So let's start digging into that a little bit further since we're on the topic of melee combat. Let's say, for example, you're wielding a one-handed slashing type weapon. This weapon type has its own set of combos that can be further unlocked with upgrade points. The later combos that can be purchased are more effective, but for the most part the inputs between all weapon types are the same. So while there is some depth to the movesets that each weapon type has, for the most part the inputs are exactly the same. This isn't a good or bad thing in my personal opinion. In fact, now that I say that, I'm leaning towards it being more so a good thing. That way you won't have to memorize a bunch of different combos on the fly as you switch between weapons. Also, the UI does give you a hint of what your next button press should be to complete a combo, so that's pretty handy and a nice quality of life feature from the devs. You can wield a fair amount of different weapon types, from two-handed slashing weapons to crushing weapons, one-handed weapons, you can even dual wield, and that's just naming a few. Biomutant definitely offers you a good selection. So that covers melee combat, but Biomutant also offers ranged combat. There are a bunch of different weapon types that you can wield, ranging from pistols, rifles, shotguns, and even assault rifles. Interestingly enough, these weapons also have combos that you can pull off and are also weapon type specific, like the melee combat. For example, the last combo you unlock in the automatic rifles list will be different from the shotgun tree. It's nice that the devs really put some thought into this, making each weapon type feel unique from one another. There's also another layer of combat that is more, let's say, magic focused, or as Biomutant likes to call it, key focused, and these abilities that can be used during combat do drain mana as they're used. These powers are unlocked with side points that cost a certain amount to unlock, and some of the abilities that you unlock do require you to be aligned with either dark or light aura, but more on that later. For the most part, using these abilities in combat is quick and easy. You can assign them to a face button and essentially spam them until you run out of mana. Outside of the side powers, there are also biogenetics, which can be unlocked with bio points, and I know this can start to sound a bit confusing, but bear with me. Biogenic mutations are similar to your side powers, as they also cost mana to use, but don't require side points to unlock. These abilities are another set of powers that augment your mutant in some form or fashion, whether by granting you ability to spew rad wisps, causing radioactive damage, or shifting to a turtle form to easily get down a mountain or slope. Most combat encounters can be beaten with a mix of melee and ranged combat without much strategy applied. No enemy I encountered really needed a specific type of damage to be done to them in order for them to take damage, which is a good thing because this allows you to really lean into a specific build without any downsides. As you participate in these combat encounters, there are some defensive tools at your disposal, starting with your ability to dodge. Dodging an enemy's hit at the right time slows everything down around you, which I'm sure is something you've probably seen before. Aside from dodging, you also have the ability to block, and a well-timed block leads to a parry. Like other games, enemies will have an indicator over their heads, tipping you off that they plan on attacking, and blocking as the indicator goes off parries the enemy. So that pretty much sums up gameplay and what you can expect from Biomutant, but really the driving force behind combat is your character's build. So let's switch gears and talk about building your mutant. I think creating your own build in this game is where it really begins to shine. So as I mentioned in the previous section, there is melee and ranged combat, but to start the game, you customize your mutant and determine what it is you're best at, whether that be strength, intellect, luck, charisma, vitality, or agility, or really any combination of these traits. As you might have guessed, strength affects your melee damage, intellect affects your power, or in other words, your magic damage. Agility is for move speed, luck is tied to your critical and loot chance, and vitality is tied to your health and armor. From there, each time you level, you're presented with an option to add plus 10 to any other previously mentioned traits. So this allows you to really hone in on one specific trait. If you want to just be an absolute melee monster, then each time you level up, throw your points into strength. As you level up, you also get upgrade points, and these upgrade points can be spent on a variety of permanent upgrades, such as having your melee attacks do 15% extra damage, or ranged weapons firing more shots before running out of ammo. There's a list of these upgrades that can be acquired so you can tailor your build. Now, some of these upgrade points that you get as you level up unlock new combos, so if you intend on unlocking some hard-hitting combos, you may need to sacrifice some of your points away. I personally had a more jack-of-all-trades kind of build where I was good at both melee and ranged combat, and I found that I never really struggled at all during my time with the game. So there isn't a crazy amount of depth in customizing your character build, as it's pretty much broken down to the 6 categories on the right, but there is quite a bit of depth in customizing your loadout. So let's dig into that. So I mentioned earlier that creating your own build is where the game begins to shine, and this is more so what I meant. Customizing your loadout in Biomutant is almost addicting. So let me break it down. Your mutant has a variety of equipment it can use, from armors that includes helmet, chest, legs, shoulders, backpacks, as well as weapons on your main hand and offhand. Let me first talk about armor. Each piece of armor has various properties that come with them. So looking at these helmets, for example, its main stat is armor, but it also has a number of add-ons that can be included. The more add-ons on a piece of gear, the more you can customize it. It also has a health value, an energy value, and an energy regen value, as well as a crit and loot chance. In all honesty, I'm not sure exactly how the values of health and energy regen are calculated. It definitely would have been nicer to have a number value like plus 200 health rather than a green bar that really doesn't tell you much. Either way, each piece of gear you loot will also have a rarity value. So these range from common, uncommon, rare, legendary, relic, and finally ultimate. As you climb up the rarity ladder, these items will either have a bigger armor value, more add-ons, as well as a greater value increase across all the stats. If a piece of gear you loot happens to have add-ons, then that gives you the ability to further customize your hard-earned loot. This helmet, for example, has 2 add-ons, allowing me to attach little pieces of scrap to it that will augment that piece of gear by increasing its loot chance, crit chance, or armor value. This add-on system carries across all different pieces of gear that you can equip. Now let's get into weapons. This is the bread and butter of Biomutant. Most weapons you wield will be crafted by you. As you scavenge and loot around the open world, you'll often pick up different weapon parts that can be combined to create something insane looking. So I'll create an example melee weapon here to demonstrate the fun crafting system that the game has. And I'll also create a ranged weapon as well, so you can get a look at that too. But let's get started. So first I'll pick a base type, and these base types are either randomly looted from the world or bought from a shop owner. The base type will really define the type of weapon you're making and also have their own set of rarities. In case you can't tell, every piece of gear you pick up in Biomutant has a rarity tied to it. The base type may also have some elemental damage tied to it. For example, this moon cutter has a scorching element, meaning it will do fire damage along with its base damage. The base type also determines the weapon class it ends up in. Some weapons will be a crush type of weapon, a one-handed slash, or one of the other available weapon types. After picking the base, you'll also need to pick a handle, which determines how much extra damage you'll do and any other extra properties that can be increased, such as crit chance. Then you can finally add some more add-ons. Some base types will have more add-on slots. This particular weapon I'm making only has 1, and these add-ons can either increase damage, add more armor pierce, and also increase crit chance as well. So you can really make some creative and melee weapons in this game. If I had to compare it to anything, Lies of P is the first thing that comes to my mind when considering weapon customization. As I mentioned, I'll also create a ranged weapon, and this follows the same structure you saw in melee crafting. First, you select the base type, which determines the weapon type. This can be either a shotgun, an assault rifle, a rifle, maybe even a pistol. You'll then be able to add different mods to the weapon, such as the grip, the magazine type, a top mod, and also a muzzle. It's also worth mentioning that some of these base types can have cool properties on them, such as the shotgun one that has a conduit attribute that doubles the special bullets, or this pistol I found that shoots a homing rocket every 4th shot. You also can find these special attributes on melee weapons as well. In addition to weapon crafting and armor modifying, you can upgrade your existing weapons and gear at workbenches, and this usually just increases the damage or armor depending on what you're trying to upgrade. Okay, so you have all these cool weapons and gear, but what do you use it for? Good question. Let's talk about the open world of Biomutant. Biomutant's open world is big, and thankfully it's not empty. You won't stray too far without running into a group of enemies, or an old abandoned neighborhood, or building with things to loot and scavenge for. Starting with the side quests, the game has a ton. You'll find NPCs in the open world who will ask you to go find something or kill something, but these side quests really aren't engaging at all. Thankfully, the game has a variety of different challenges for you to take on. These include finding and killing bandit captains, finding old world storages, solving a bunch of puzzles, deciding the fate of captives, and that's just to say that the game has a lot to do, and I just scratch the surface with the amount of side activities that the game has for you to take on. I do also like that the game has a checklist for different areas you come across. This is similar to something you would see in Assassin's Creed Origins or Odyssey. You'll know what to look for in an area, and once you've completed it, the game will let you know that the area is completed and there's really no reason to stick around. It's a nice touch. In the open world, you'll also come across groups of enemies. Sometimes these groups will have larger enemies, and you'll know this when a health bar pops up on your screen, letting you know you're in for a big fight. You can get around the open world using your mount, helping you cross distances at a slightly faster pace. You can also get around the water using jet ski, and also a mech, which can only be used in certain areas. And you also do have the option to use a glider when jumping off mountains, or really anywhere with a bit of height. I don't really want to spoil much more than that, but the devs did do a nice job of giving the player options. Enemy variety in Biomutant is pretty well done. Of course, you'll encounter enemies you've seen often in areas where their tribe is ruling, but there's a good amount of variety between them. You'll have range-based enemies who use assault rifles and sniper rifles. You'll also have melee-based enemies who use swords and other melee weapons as well. There are other mutant-type enemies as well who range from small, annoying types that roll around, or really larger types that lumber around and hit hard. The open world does have large monsters scattered around as well, and sometimes they'll be guarding a key that's hiding a bunker nearby with some good loot. Overall, the enemy variety in Biomutant is pretty well done. The main story of the game has you doing one of two things. You're either helping your tribe conquer areas, whether by combat or dialogue, or helping NPCs build weapons that will assist you in taking down a world eater. And to be honest, that's basically it. The game does get quickly repetitive in the sense that you'll be doing the same couple of missions time and time again throughout the main story, with some slight variations and differences here and there. For the most part though, you'll go and retrieve something for an NPC and slowly build a useful piece of equipment in a fight with a world eater, or you'll be attacking an outpost where you're either met with a boss fight or a dialogue option to settle things without fighting, and that's really pretty much it. The world eater fights themselves are actually pretty unique, and each have their own strategy that you'll need to apply in order to win the fight. So overall, your tolerance for repetitiveness will need to be pretty high if you plan on doing a full playthrough. So I did briefly mention the light and dark system earlier, and as you play through the main story, you'll be faced with decisions to make, and this is where that light and dark morale system comes to play. Some decisions you make will either be seen as an evil choice or a good choice, and this skews how NPCs will perceive you and react to you in various dialogue. The light and dark system also plays a role in the powers that you can unlock. For instance, having a certain amount of dark aura will allow you to select the telekinesis side power. This system basically gives the player further replayability, as your two playthroughs can be pretty different depending on the choices you make. I want to really quickly touch on the difficulty of the game. So when the game first released, the common theme was that the game was too easy. And during my playthrough, I can definitely see how people could feel that way. It's relatively easy getting overpowered in the game, and I almost really never died to a group of enemies or even to a boss, outside of a few times where I either miscalculated a dodge or parry. Going with a ranged character would likely make this game a breeze, especially if you have a really good ranged weapon. So if you plan on playing Biomutant, I would strongly recommend playing it either on the hard difficulty or the hardest difficulty if you want to go in for a challenge. Even if you don't really want a challenge, I would still suggest playing it on hard because the normal difficulty is pretty easy. Now let's quickly jump over to the production values, and when I talk about production values, I mainly mean sounds and graphics. So the game lacks pretty heavily in the sound department. The impact of your hits on an enemy, from melee to shooting guns, just doesn't sound good. It doesn't feel like you're connecting with your hits at times. Also, there really are no speaking characters in the game outside of the narrator. The NPCs will usually mumble something, and then the narrator will do some sort of translation to English for you, kind of telling you the NPC's thoughts or what they're currently saying, but that's really it. And to be completely honest, the narrator does get quite annoying. In fact, I ended up turning down the narrator frequency quite a bit because he would often chime in with random lines as I was exploring the open world that really had nothing to do with what I was doing at the time. So let's move on to performance. For the most part, performance wasn't nearly perfect. I played the game on PS5 and rarely saw any significant frame drops. In fact, the game ran smoothly pretty much through my whole playthrough, except some specific areas when I was in a mech which had the most obvious performance drops. Outside of that, the game looked and ran great, and I did play the PS5 version of the game, which was released in 2022. So quick note on the updates since launch. Since the release, there have been a number of updates, mostly bug fixes or some quality of life improvements, but the most significant of which was in June 2022 when Experiment 101 released a native PS5 and Xbox Series X version of the game. This upped the performance up to 60 FPS at 1440p in performance mode and 30 FPS in 4K resolution in the quality mode. They also added a quality unleashed mode, which was basically 40 FPS plus up to 4K. Also, surprisingly, in May of 2024, the game did have a Nintendo Switch release. So I can't help but recommend the game for people who are into looters and creating their own build. I think there is something here for those types of gamers. The game does lack in areas like story, sound, and mission design, but it makes up for it in its open world and laundry list of activities to do. If you like checking things off your list, Biomutant is going to be for you. If you don't enjoy a big open world, if you don't enjoy a game that doesn't really have a strong story and has a lot of inventory management, I would steer clear of Biomutant. The game also does have New Game Plus, so you'll have your time filled for quite a bit. The main story and some side activities took me around 18 hours, but for someone who's looking to do a full completion run, I can see this game taking upwards of 40 hours. So I hope this review was helpful for you in deciding whether or not you should play Biomutant. If it was, please feel free to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button on the video as well. That would be super helpful. Thank you guys for watching as always, and I will see you all in the next one.